Well, welcome to episode 353 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Toshiko Akiyoshi, the Japanese piano player from 1961 on King Records, called Toshiko Meets Her Old Pals. What I have here is a 1974 reissue on King, which is pretty much immaculate in every way. I didn't actually buy it on my recent trip to Japan, but I got excited about it when I was there, and I've ordered it since, and it arrived in days, amazingly. Toshiko Akiyoshi was basically the first Japanese musician to become popular with jazz fans elsewhere. Her career spans many, many decades. She starts off playing dance halls in post-war occupied Japan. She then starts leading small combos in Tokyo. She plays in the US, the hippest clubs in Greenwich Village in the early 60s. She later goes on to reinvent herself as kind of a big band composer. She wins downbeat polls, she wins Grammy nominations, and so on. And this record is from perhaps her career peak as a small group leader, reuniting her with some of her former bandmates when she went back to Japan after spending some time in the US in the early 1960s. And it is, I think, one of the greatest jazz records that you may never have heard. Toshiko Akiyoshi was born in occupied Manchuria in 1929. Her family were upper class. Her dad ran textile and steel mills, and she and her sisters all had a pretty formal upper class Japanese education for girls. So they studied ballet, they studied traditional Japanese dance, they studied piano, classical piano. Toshiko was passionate about the piano. She pretty soon abandoned all of the dance related aspects of her curriculum, but all of the assumptions of the pre-war Japanese elite were, of course, thrown up into the air by the fact that the Japanese lost the war. And in 1945-46, all of the Japanese colonists in Manchuria had to get the hell out because the Russians were coming in, and they moved back not to a prosperous Japan, but to occupied, devastated Japan. The family basically lost everything. They settled in a medium-sized town in Kyushu called Beppo. Gone were all the creature comforts of colonial life. Gone was their piano. However, with the loss in the war came the US occupation and a huge influx of American servicemen who wanted some nightlife. And so there came to be a massive demand for musicians of any kind who could play dance hall music or were at least willing to try. Toshiko had been starved of piano playing since she was in Manchuria. She saw an ad for a dance hall piano player, so she answered the ad and played a Beethoven piano sonata as her audition. Initially, Toshiko had taken the gig just to have access to a piano so that she could, in her spare moments, practice her classical repertoire. But a few months in, a Japanese record collector attended one of her shows and was struck by her talent and said to her after the show, you should really be playing jazz, such as your talent. Well, she'd never heard any. So he played her a Teddy Wilson record, Sweet Lorraine, and for Toshiko, that was it. The light bulb turned on. This guy actually, incidentally, remains a fan and a friend of hers all the way through her career, amazingly enough. She began to study jazz immediately. Pretty soon, she told her mom and dad she was moving to Tokyo. She got some work in small clubs that catered to both American and Japanese jazz fans. And by 1951, when she's in her early 20s, she's leading her own group. Now, it wasn't that easy to lead your own group because finding the music you wanted to play was a bit of a challenge. It's hard to buy the sheet music. Jazz records were kind of inaccessible for Japanese folks at that particular time. There was a little bit of jazz on the radio, but mainly on the U.S. Armed Forces radio. There was jazz, particularly in the black U.S. Army clubs, the Americans having brought their own version of freedom to Japan. And Toshiko managed to listen to jazz wherever she could in some of these settings, also at these jazz coffee houses, which had started to emerge to serve a Japanese clientele that didn't really have access to these other places. And all of this was in aid of listening to the music so she could write it down, transcribe it, so that her band can play it. And this was basically how her band developed repertoire, was her listening by ear and creating the charts. The bebop scene in Tokyo in the late 40s, early 50s was small, but some notable players began to coalesce, including Sadao Watanabe, the well-known alto sax player, well, at least these days, who she took on as a sideman, basically discovered him early on. Her big break comes in 1952. Norman Granz, the founder of Clef Records, Norgran Records, Verve Records, used to run something called Jazz at the Philharmonic. He had one of these tours running in Japan, 1952. Oscar Peterson is on the tour, and Oscar goes out one evening in the Ginza district. He goes to a club and he hears Toshiko Akiyoshi playing, and he is absolutely blown away. And he gets hold of Grant, who's there at the time, and says, "You have to record her." And so, with the other members of Peterson's group, Herb Ellis on guitar, Ray Brown on bass, and J.C. Hurd on drums, she makes a record called Toshiko's Piano, which Grant puts out on Verve, and it is a big hit in the States. She's very soon the best known and the best paid jazz musician in Japan, but that meant being a big fish in what was still a very small pond. She knew that if she wanted to improve as a musician, she needed to go to the States. She'd heard about the Berklee School of Music. She wrote to them. She included her LP along with her application letter. They offered her a full ride. And so in the beginning of 1956, she moves to Boston to study music full time. She stays there for 3 years. 2 months after she arrives in the States, somewhat bizarrely, she appears as a mystery panelist on the TV show What's My Line? I've left a link to the episode in the description for this video. It's equal parts fascinating and cringeworthy. The panelists are as taken by her Japaneseness and her gender and her exoticism as they are by the fact that she's a jazz musician. And this was a pattern which was to continue. Her Japaneseness, her gender tended to overshadow her music. She got a lot of attention, but in the way that a zoo animal sometimes receives attention. Despite being perceived as something of a circus act, she nonetheless moves to New York City in 1959, and she beds in with the incredible jazz scene that's happening at the time. It's a heck of a time for any jazz musician to move to New York. She played all the in clubs like Birdland and the Five Spot. She was written up in time. She sat in with everybody. She married the former Stan Kenton saxophonist Charlie Mariano, and she formed a quartet with him. Because she'd studied composition at Berklee, she also began to write compositions for big bands and made a tidy little living doing that. And she also had a period of time, fairly extended period of time, working with Mingus. But these early years in the US were not the easiest for her, and in the first half of the 1960s, she began to spend more and more time back in Japan, and this record comes from one of those very early visits back to Tokyo. This record results from 3 concerts which were set up by King Records for Toshiko playing with her old bandmates over 3 different nights in March 1961, on the 7th and 8th of March at Sujinami Concert Hall and on the 27th at Bunkyo Concert Hall. The musicians, of course, include Toshiko Akiyoshi on piano, Sadao Watanabe and Akira Miyazawa on alto and tenor sax respectively, and 3 different rhythm sections which I can only imagine were associated with the 3 different dates. On the first 2 tracks on side 1, it's Masanaga Harada on bass and Masahiko Togashi, of whom I spoke last week, on drums. Then on the last track on side 1 and the first track on side 2, it's Achiro Kurita on bass and Hideo Shiraki on drums. And on the last 2 tracks on the record, Harada returns on bass and Takeshi Inomata is on drums. The producer is Jiro Kubota, who was kind of the Nat Hentoff of Japan in that he was a jazz journalist, a music critic, but would also act as a producer from time to time and step into the control room. And we can all be grateful that he did, because the sound on this record is absolutely stunning. Side 1 starts with So What, a somewhat perkier, slightly less brooding version of the Miles Davis classic, achieved, I think, through some very minor but telling changes to the main riff. Next is a frequently covered standard, The Night Has a Thousand Eyes. This features a very distinctive rhythm pattern from Togashi with all these rim shots, and Toshiko's solo, which is the only solo on the track, is accompanied only by him doing that same rhythmic pattern, so it's quite unusual. The final track on side 1 is an excellent and quite faithful cover of the bebop standard Donna Lee, and it's underpinned particularly by Hideo Shiraki's enthusiastic style and by Toshiko's Bud Powell influences. Side 2 begins with a composition by Toshiko's husband, Charlie Mariano, called Quebec. This is just delicious. The bass is recorded beautifully all the way through this record, but on this one you can just feel it in your throat and your sternum. Old Pals is written by Akiyoshi specifically for this reunion, and for me, her solo and Miyazawa's tenor are the standout contributions here. And the final track on the record is Watasu no Beethoven, which is a fascinating, slightly avant-garde composition with some heavy classical elements as well, which could have come from the pen of Mingus, or Giuffre, or Coltrane, or Jackie McLean. It's an intriguing end to a very intriguing record. This record features varied compositions. There are standards that are played in novel ways. It exhibits, on behalf of the musicians, a mastery of several quite distinct styles, but all of which kind of fit within what you might call straight-ahead jazz. The mystifying thing to me is how low profile this record is. To me, the quality of what's played here, combined with the quality of the production, is right up there with the very best product that was coming out of Blue Note or Prestige in 1960-61. If you did want to quibble, you might say that the range of compositions and styles on here maybe denies the record its own unique identity, but I feel it all works together. The music and the sound will absolutely delight you, and for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.